In the remote wilderness of Black Hollow Forest, a lone hiker was about to uncover something he was never meant to see. A routine trek turned into a nightmare when strange symbols carved into the trees led him astray, guiding him towards something that had been waiting. Ethan Grayson wasn't your typical outdoorsman. For 15 years, he had been a survival expert and wilderness guide, known for navigating some of the most treacherous landscapes on Earth. But no amount of training could have prepared him for what lurked in these woods. When the markings formed a path that shouldn't exist, Ethan followed, never realizing he was walking straight into a trap. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest twisted, shifting beneath his feet. And when night fell, it watched him. Every step forward led him further from the world he knew, and deeper into something ancient, something hungry. What began as a simple hike would become a fight for survival against an entity that thrived on the lost. Black Hollow Forest would never be the same after Ethan Grayson left his mark, or after it left its mark on him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ethan Grayson breathed in the crisp autumn air as he stood at the trailhead of Black Hollow Forest. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, a welcome change from the stale city air. He adjusted his backpack, the familiar weight of survival gear a comfort against his shoulders. This week-long trek was exactly what he needed. Solitude, challenge, and the clarity that only came from testing himself against the wilderness. Perfect weather for a hike, he murmured to himself, pulling out his phone to document his starting point. The forest stretched before him, dense and inviting, its canopy already transforming into a tapestry of amber and gold. He snapped a photo, then checked his GPS coordinates one last time before tucking the device away. The locals at the last gas station had watched him with wary eyes when he'd mentioned his destination. People go missing in Black Hollow, the elderly cashier had warned, voice lowered as if sharing a secret. They walk in, but sometimes they don't walk out. Ethan had nodded politely, but inwardly dismissed the warning. Every remote area had its legends, its cautionary tales meant to keep tourists from wandering off trails and requiring rescue. After 15 years of wilderness expeditions, he knew the real dangers weren't mystical. They were hypothermia, dehydration, and poor preparation, none of which concerned him. The trail started gently enough, a well-worn path that gradually narrowed as it wound deeper into the forest. Ethan walked with purpose, mentally noting landmarks, his trained eye cataloging the terrain. He'd expected to enjoy the peacefulness, but something felt off from the beginning, a stillness that seemed too complete, as if the forest were holding its breath. 3 hours in, he paused to check his bearings. That's when he noticed it. A spiral carved into the trunk of a massive oak, too precise to be natural, too fresh to be ancient. The cuts were clean, the exposed wood still pale. Ethan ran his fingers over the grooves, frowning. Recent, he muttered, very recent. He scanned the surrounding area, half expecting to see other hikers, but the forest remained eerily silent. No birds called, no squirrels rustled through the underbrush, just the occasional whisper of wind through the leaves. He shrugged off his unease and continued forward, but found himself stopping every few minutes to glance back over his shoulder. Just after midday, he entered a clearing that didn't appear on his map. The moment he stepped into the open space, the world seemed to muffle around him. His footsteps, normally crunching over fallen leaves, became oddly subdued. He cleared his throat and the sound seemed to die at his lips. "What the hell?" he whispered, voice unnaturally flat in the still air. Ethan pulled out his compass, watching as the needle swung erratically, unable to settle on north. He frowned, tapping the glass face. Equipment malfunction was rare, especially with his high-quality gear. He reached for his phone to check GPS, but the screen flickered, coordinates jumping wildly before settling on numbers that couldn't possibly be correct. A low whisper drifted across the clearing, too articulated to be wind, too distant to decipher. Ethan's head snapped up, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" he called out. His voice fell flat, as if the air itself swallowed the sound. No response came, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Get it together, Grayson, it's just the wind, or maybe a fox." But as he crossed the clearing, his mind flashed back to a memory he'd spent a decade trying to suppress. Mason's hiking boots, caked with mud, sitting by the door of their shared apartment. The last time he'd seen them before, his brother ventured into the wilderness and vanished without a trace. "You worry too much, little brother," Mason had said, grinning as he shouldered his pack. "Nature doesn't scare me." The search parties had found nothing. No body, no equipment, no sign of what had happened. Just miles of untouched forest that seemed to have swallowed him whole. Ethan pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the path ahead. The trees grew denser, casting longer shadows as the afternoon progressed. He was making good time despite the strange clearing. By nightfall, he'd reached the first campsite he'd marked on his map. That's when he saw the second symbol, not a spiral this time, but a more complex design carved into a slender birch. Beneath it, in roughly etched letters, "Not a path, a door." Ethan stared at the words, a chill crawling up his spine despite the logical explanations that immediately presented themselves. Trail markers, teenagers playing pranks, perhaps even signs from an old logging operation. But why did they look so fresh? He should turn back. The smart move would be to report the strange carvings to the park rangers, let them investigate. But curiosity tugged at him, the same stubborn need to know that had driven him to become a wilderness guide in the first place. The same need that had sent him searching for Mason long after the official rescue had been called off. Just a little further, he told himself, continuing down the path. "I'll make camp, and if things still feel off in the morning, I'll head back." As he walked, the forest darkened prematurely, shadows stretching longer than they should for the time of day. Ethan checked his watch. 4:17 p.m. At least 3 hours of daylight remained, yet the forest floor was already cloaked in twilight. More symbols appeared, carved into trees at irregular intervals. Some resembled letters from alphabets he couldn't identify. Others were pictographs that stirred something primal in his memory. With each new marking, rationalization became harder. By the time true dusk arrived, Ethan realized he was lost. Not just off trail, he was experienced enough to navigate by terrain, but fundamentally disoriented. Landmarks he'd noted earlier seemed to have shifted. Slopes that should have led downhill curved back up. His compass, when consulted again, spun lazily in complete circles. "This isn't possible," he muttered, fighting the edge of panic in his voice. He decided to make camp, to start fresh in the morning with clear eyes and rested legs. As he unpacked his tent, a flicker of light caught his peripheral vision. Deep among the trees, a pale blue glow pulsed gently. It appeared too steady for a campfire, too isolated for a ranger station. Ethan froze, transfixed. The light beckoned, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. Every logical part of his mind screamed danger, but an even stronger impulse pulled him forward. It was the same feeling he'd had 10 years ago when the search parties gave up and he'd continued alone, convinced that if he just looked long enough, he'd find what everyone else had missed. "Mason?" he whispered, the name escaping before. He could stop it. The light pulsed once, brighter as if in response. As darkness enveloped the forest completely, Ethan made his decision. He repacked his gear with trembling hands, heart pounding against his ribs. Whatever waited in the depths of Black Hollow Forest, he would face it. After all, he'd come here seeking a challenge, and now one had found him. He clicked on his headlamp and stepped toward the pulsing light, unaware that with each step the path behind him was quietly disappearing, the trees shifting to erase any hope of retreat. The blue light pulsed ahead of Ethan, always just beyond reach. It drifted, between trees with purpose, as if leading him somewhere specific. His headlamp cut through the darkness, but somehow the glow remained visible, hovering like a will-o'-the-wisp from the folklore his grandfather used to tell him about. Spirits that led travelers astray. "This is insane," Ethan muttered, pushing aside a low-hanging branch. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Bioluminescent fungi, reflections from mineral deposits, even hallucinations from exhaustion. None felt convincing. After 20 minutes of pursuit, the light disappeared. Ethan stopped, sweeping his headlamp across the darkness, but found only trees and more trees. He was about to turn back when his beam caught something on the ground, a narrow footpath, barely visible among the underbrush, as if nature had attempted to reclaim it. The path looked worn, yet somehow wrong. It didn't follow the natural contours of the land, but cut straight through areas where no trail should logically go. And along its edges, more symbols had been carved into the trees, deeper, older than the ones he'd seen before. Ethan knelt to examine the ground. No recent footprints besides his own, yet the path was clearly defined. When he stood and looked ahead, he noticed the trees lining the trail bore spirals and angular markings that seemed to point forward. "Not exactly subtle," he said, trying to mask his unease with sarcasm. The next marking he found was different. Not a symbol, but words carved deeply into an ancient oak. "Go back before it sees you." Ethan's breath caught. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeped into his bones. For the first time since entering the forest, genuine fear fluttered in his chest. He pulled out his phone, intending to document the carving, but the screen remained dark. Dead battery? Impossible. He'd charged it fully before setting out, and the battery pack in his bag should have provided backup. "Hello?" A distant voice called, so faint he nearly missed it. Ethan froze, straining to listen. "Is someone there?" The voice was clearer now, familiar in a way that made his heart thunder against his ribs. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "Mason?" Ethan whispered, afraid to believe. "Ethan? Help. Me." The voice sounded exactly like his brother's. The slight rasp, the way he emphasized the second syllable of Ethan's name. It came from deeper along the trail, past where the warning was carved. Reason told him to be cautious. After 10 years, Mason couldn't possibly be here, calling his name. But the same instinct that had driven him to continue searching when everyone else gave up now propelled him forward. "Mason, where are you?" he called, hurrying along the path. No response came, only the strange, muffled quality of the forest swallowing his words. Ethan pulled out his GPS unit, a separate device from his phone, more reliable in remote areas. The screen flickered to life but displayed only garbled coordinates, numbers that shifted randomly each time he looked away and back again. According to one reading, he was somehow 2,000 feet below sea level. According to the next, he was in Antarctica. He shoved the useless device back into his pocket and continued forward, guided only by his headlamp and the faint trail. As he walked, the path began to behave strangely. Twice he found himself crossing his own tracks, though he hadn't knowingly made any turns. The third time, he stopped and deliberately marked a tree with a strip of reflective tape from his pack. 20 minutes later, he passed the same tree, but the tape was now on the opposite side of the trunk, as if the tree had rotated. "This isn't happening," he said, pressing his palms against his eyes. When he looked again, the forest had changed subtly. The trees seemed wrong. Their bark appeared to flow like liquid in slow motion, patterns shifting when he wasn't looking, directly at them. Ethan took a deep breath, fighting the panic rising in his throat. He was a skilled survivalist. He'd navigated whiteout conditions in mountain ranges and trackless deserts. This was just a forest playing tricks on his mind. Exhaustion, stress, maybe even mild hallucinations from some plant he'd inadvertently touched. Focus, he told himself. One step at a time. He continued along the path, which now seemed to wind in complete contradiction to the terrain. Uphill sections led downward. What should have been a ridge opened into a valley that didn't appear on any of his maps. The trees grew more twisted the deeper he went, their trunks contorted into impossible shapes, some bent at right angles, others spiraled around themselves like corkscrews. Their branches reached toward him with an intentionality that plants shouldn't possess. "Mason!" he called again, desperation creeping into his voice. No answer came. Another hour passed, or what felt like an hour. His watch now showed different times whenever he checked it. The moon, when visible through breaks in the canopy, seemed wrong too. Too large, too bright, with shadows that moved independently of the clouds. Ethan stopped when he noticed something embedded in a tree trunk at eye level. Not a carving this time, but a physical object. An old compass, its brass casing tarnished and weathered, had been pressed into the living wood until the tree grew around it, sealing it in place. He ran his fingers over the glass face. The needle spun wildly, just like his own compass had. Curiosity overcoming caution, he pried at the edges with his pocket knife until the compass popped free, leaving a perfect impression in the bark. Inside, folded into a tight square, was a yellowed piece of paper. Ethan unfolded it carefully, revealing a message written in faded ink. "You are not the first." Below the message was a crude map, unrecognizable as any part of Black Hollow Forest he knew, with symbols matching those carved into the trees, marked at various points. At the center, a large spiral had been drawn with a warning scrawled beside it. "Do not approach." Ethan studied the map, trying to match it to his mental geography of the area, but nothing aligned. It was as if he'd stepped into a different forest entirely, one that obeyed different rules. The realization struck him with terrifying clarity. He wasn't lost in the conventional sense. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that merely wore the skin of Black Hollow Forest. "Mason," he whispered, "what did you find out here?" Had his brother stumbled upon these same markings? Had he followed this same impossible path? All these years, Ethan had pictured Mason injured in a ravine or swept away by a flash flood. Tragic but explicable fates. Never had he imagined this. He tucked the map into his pocket, renewed determination overriding his fear. If Mason had been here, if there was even the slightest chance his brother still needed help, he would continue. The path narrowed. Further, the symbols on the trees glowing faintly now with a phosphorescence that hadn't been visible before. Ethan followed their eerie light, no longer needing his headlamp to see the way forward. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any natural forest. A low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath his feet, more felt than heard. It rose in pitch slowly, becoming a sound no human or animal throat could produce, ancient and wrong. The symbols around him pulsed brighter in response, as if awakening to the noise. Ahead on the path, something moved in the darkness. A shadow, deeper than the night itself, shifting between the trees. Ethan stood frozen, watching as the darkness took form, then melted away again. The symbols continued to glow, illuminating his presence like a beacon in the night, and somehow he knew with absolute certainty it had seen him. Ethan ran. His feet pounded against the earth as he fled from whatever had stirred in the darkness. The symbols pulsed in his wake, their glow intensifying as if feeding off his fear. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging in front of his face despite the autumn night being merely cool, not frigid. He ran until his lungs burned, until the path ahead forked unexpectedly. Without thinking, he veered left, diving deeper into the twisted heart of the forest. The guttural sound faded behind him, but the certainty of being watched remained, pressing against his consciousness like a physical weight. When he finally stopped, hands braced on his knees, gasping for air, Ethan found himself in a small clearing he hadn't seen before. The moonlight, still too bright, too large, illuminated what appeared to be the remains of a campsite. A tattered tent sagged between two trees, its once blue fabric faded to the color of dust. Around it lay scattered equipment, a rusted cooking pot, the skeletal remains of a backpack, a walking stick with intricate carvings along its length. The scene looked like it had been abandoned years ago, yet there was something unnervingly pristine about it. No leaf litter covered the items, no moss grew on the tent poles. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice weak. The silence that answered felt deliberate, as if the forest were holding its breath. He approached the tent cautiously, unclipping his knife from his belt. The tent flap moved slightly, though there was no breeze. With the tip of his blade, Ethan pushed it aside. The interior was empty of human presence, but contained more abandoned gear. A sleeping bag torn open as if something had clawed through it. A flashlight with its lens shattered. And a leather-bound journal, its edges blackened as if someone had tried to burn it. Ethan reached for the journal, hesitating for only a moment before picking it up. The leather felt wrong against his skin, too warm, almost feverish. He opened it anyway. The first pages contained mundane observations about Black Hollow Forest. Weather, conditions, wildlife sightings, coordinates that made no sense now but presumably had when they were written. The handwriting was tight and precise, belonging to someone methodical. As the entries progressed, however, the writing grew increasingly erratic, the pressure of the pen leaving deep impressions in the paper. Day 4, one entry began. The carvings are not random. They form a pattern when mapped. I'm going to follow them to see where they lead. Several pages later, Day 6, 7, time is wrong here. Watch keeps changing. The path loops but never returns. To the beginning. Then, scrawled across an entire page in bold, desperate strokes, it sees when you move. Do not stop. Ethan's hands trembled as he turned to the next page where a crude drawing depicted a tall, elongated figure standing between trees. Its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, head too small. Beside it, the writer had noted, "It watches, always watches." He closed the journal, suddenly aware of his exposed position in the clearing. Slowly, he turned in a circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being observed intensified. Ethan checked his watch, 8:17 p.m. He blinked, and the digits changed to 11:43 p.m. Another blink, 3:21 a.m. The numbers shuffled randomly, time slipping through his grasp like water. Get a grip, he whispered to himself, but his confident survivalist persona was crumbling. He'd always believed that with enough skill, enough preparation, nature could be understood and navigated. But this defied understanding. A memory surfaced. Mason sitting across from him at a diner, 3 days before his final hike. "There are places in the wilderness that don't follow the rules, Ethan," Mason had said, eyes alight with that familiar, reckless excitement. "Places where reality thins." "That's just campfire mythology," Ethan had replied, dismissive. Mason's smile had faltered. "You're so determined to catalog everything, to make the wild fit your neat little boxes. But what if there are things out there that can't be classified? Things that classify you?" Ethan had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. He stuffed the journal into his pack and began gathering the abandoned equipment, looking for anything useful. The walking stick felt strangely right in his hand, its carvings similar to those on the trees but more intricate. He used it to probe the ground around the campsite, uncovering nothing else of note. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye. A dark figure standing perfectly still between two distant trees. Not a shadow, but something solid yet indistinct, as if reality blurred around its edges. Ethan froze, afraid to even breathe. The figure didn't move. It simply stood, watching, its form absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. Ethan backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the shape. He blinked, and it was gone. The space between the trees stood empty. Had it been there at all? He pressed his palms against his eyes, doubt gnawing at his sanity. When he looked up, the figure had reappeared, closer now, though he hadn't heard it move. Panic surged through him. Ethan snatched up his pack and the journal, abandoning the rest of the equipment. He fled the clearing, no longer caring which direction he took as long as it was away from that silent observer. The path seemed to guide him, opening up before his feet, as if the forest itself were directing his route. The symbols on the trees glowed brighter as he passed, illuminating his way through the impossible darkness. He ran until he reached another carving, this one larger than the others, spanning the entire trunk of a massive oak. The message was simple but chilling. The longer you stay, the more it knows you. Ethan sank to his knees before the tree, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Mason, the journal, the watching figure, the twisted path that led nowhere yet everywhere. With trembling hands, he reopened the journal, flipping to the final pages. The writing here was barely legible, the letters jagged and desperate. It feeds on fear, on disorientation. It wants you lost because lost things belong to it. And then on the very last page, a final entry. There is a way out. The markings aren't just warnings, they're a map, a lock. They must be finished. The seal was broken, but it can be remade. If you find this, if you're trapped like me, you must complete the pattern before it's too late, before you become like the others. Below this was a diagram, a complex arrangement of symbols, many matching those Ethan had seen throughout the forest. Several spaces remained blank as if waiting to be filled. Ethan studied the diagram, trying to make sense of it. Was this why Mason had come here? Had he known about these markings, this entity, whatever it was? The walking stick in his hand suddenly felt heavier. He examined the carvings along its length more carefully and realized they matched segments of the diagram in the journal. A key, he whispered, or a tool. The revelation brought no comfort, only a deepening dread. Whatever force ruled this twisted version of Black Hollow Forest, it had claimed others before him. The abandoned campsite, the journal writer, maybe even Mason. And now it was watching him, learning him, waiting for... what? As if in answer, a sound rose from the depths of the forest, the same guttural rumble as before, but closer now. The symbols on the nearby trees flared brightly, then dimmed as if responding to the noise. Ethan rose to his feet, clutching the walking stick like a weapon. The sound grew louder, surrounding him, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And in that moment he understood what the journal had meant. He needed to finish what someone else had started, or join the lost souls of Black Hollow Forest, forever. Dawn should have arrived hours ago according to Ethan's malfunctioning watch, yet darkness persisted, broken only by the eerie glow of the symbols that lined his path. He had studied the journal through the night, memorizing the diagram, searching for clues about what he needed to do. The walking stick felt like an extension of himself now, its carved surface occasionally warming beneath his palm when he passed certain symbols. Following the journal's fragmented instructions, Ethan had begun tracking the pattern of markings, noting their positions on the crude map he'd found in the compass. Has to lead somewhere, he muttered, voice hoarse from disuse and fear. The path descended into a valley that, according to his topographical maps, shouldn't exist. Mist clung to the ground, unnaturally still, not swirling around his ankles as it should have. Through the haze, structures began to emerge, angular shadows, against the perpetual twilight. Ethan froze. Buildings, deep in the supposedly uninhabited heart of Black Hollow Forest. As he approached, the wrongness of the settlement became apparent. The structures weren't just old, they were architecturally impossible. Walls bent at angles that defied geometry, roofs curved inward instead of outward, doorways tilted as if the buildings were slowly being twisted by an invisible force. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered. No roads connected the buildings, no paths besides the symbol-lined trail that had led him here. The village, if it could be called that, appeared to have sprouted from the forest floor like malformed fungi. The buildings were constructed of stone and wood that matched the surrounding forest, as if they had grown rather than been built. Symbols had been carved into every available surface: doorframes, walls, even the stones that formed crude pathways between structures. Many matched those in the journal's diagram, but others were new, more complex, almost painful to look at directly. Ethan approached the nearest building, heart hammering in his chest. Its door hung ajar, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The symbols around the doorframe glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Hello?" he called, though he expected no answer. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something compelled him forward, a horrified fascination overriding his survival instincts. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed. pressure building in his ears as a low, constant hum vibrated through his bones. The interior was a single room, its dimensions somehow larger than the outside suggested possible. Furniture lay scattered and broken, a table bent into an arch, chairs with too many legs, shelves that wrapped around corners at impossible angles. On the far wall hung a mirror in a frame carved with the now familiar spirals. Ethan approached it cautiously, afraid of what he might see. At first, his reflection appeared normal, haggard, eyes dark with exhaustion, face stubbled with 3 days' growth. Then he raised his hand to touch the glass. His reflection remained still for a heartbeat before mimicking the motion. Ethan stepped back, breath catching. He raised his hand again. Again the delay, as if his reflection existed in a place where time moved differently. He turned away from the mirror, scanning the room more carefully. In the corner lay a backpack, newer than the ancient furniture, its fabric weathered but recognizable as modern equipment. Beside it, partially hidden by fallen debris, something gleamed white in the dim light. Bones. Human bones. A skeleton sat propped against the wall, flesh long gone, clothes rotted to threads around the frame. Between its bony fingers was clutched a leather-bound notebook, similar to the journal he'd found at the campsite but intact, its cover embossed with initials. O.M. With trembling hands, Ethan knelt and carefully extracted the notebook. The skeleton shifted, several small bones, clattering to the floor. A metal identification tag on a chain slid from what remained of the corpse's clothing. Dr. Olivia Mercer, Anthropological Research Team, Barton University. The name sparked recognition. 5 years ago, headlines about a missing anthropologist who had ventured into remote woodland to study indigenous folklore. The search had been called off after weeks without success. Another soul claimed by the wilderness, or by whatever lurked within it. Ethan opened the notebook with reverent care. Unlike the frantic scrawls of the journal, these notes were methodical, academic, at least initially. Page after page of research on folklore surrounding Black Hollow Forest, theories about ancient cultures that might have inhabited the region, transcriptions of local legends about people who entered the forest and emerged, changed, if they emerged, at all. As the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Excitement grew as Olivia documented her discovery of the first symbols, her theories that they represented a forgotten language. She had been drawn deeper, following the markings, convinced she was on the verge of a breakthrough that would redefine anthropological understanding of the region. Then the entries became darker, mirroring the journal he'd found earlier. The symbols aren't a language, they're a boundary. A warning system. The locals were right. Something dwells in these woods, something old. Later. I've found the settlement. It's architecturally impossible. Predates colonial records, yet contains elements that shouldn't exist in any ancient North American culture. The symbols are everywhere. They're holding something back. One of the final entries sent ice through Ethan's veins. I understand now. The path was never meant to be followed. The symbols aren't an invitation, they're a seal, a boundary between worlds. I was wrong. If you see this, run. Run before it learns your name. The very last page contained a hastily drawn map, similar to the diagram in the journal, but more complete. It showed the village and the surrounding forest with a large structure at its center marked with a spiral. Notes in the margins described a ritual, a way to close the door that had been opened. Olivia had been trying to reseal whatever had been unleashed, and she had failed. Ethan stared at the skeleton, a deep sadness washing over him. She had died here, alone, trying to undo her mistake. I'm sorry, he whispered to the remains. He tucked the notebook into his pack alongside the journal and stepped back outside. The village seemed to have shifted while he was inside, buildings now arranged in a different pattern, forming a rough spiral that led toward the center. At the heart of the spiral stood a structure larger than the others, a building that resembled a temple or meeting house. Its doorway a perfect circle carved with symbols that glowed brighter than any he'd seen before. Ethan knew with terrible certainty that he needed to enter that building. Whatever answers existed would be found there. Whatever ritual might free him from this place would be centered there. As he walked toward it, the symbols on his path flared to life, illuminating his way with cold blue light. The humming in the air intensified, becoming almost musical in its complexity, a sound no human instrument could produce. The walking stick in his hand vibrated in response, its carvings now glowing with the same light as the symbols. It was a key, he realized, a tool meant to interact with the markings. When he reached the central building's threshold, Ethan paused. Olivia's warning echoed in his mind. Run. But where? The forest had transformed around him, reality itself warping to trap him in this impossible place. There was no running, only forward. He stepped through the circular doorway, and something shifted in the world around him. The constant feeling of being watched intensified to an almost physical pressure. In the center of the room stood a stone altar covered in symbols that matched those in both journals. And then he heard it, not the guttural rumble from before, but a voice. Low, multi-toned, as if many throats spoke in unison. Ethan Grayson. It knew his name. The symbols throughout the village flared blindingly bright, then dimmed to a pulsing glow. The air crackled with energy, reality itself seeming to thin. Something was coming. The watcher had tired of observing from afar. It was coming for him. Ethan Grayson. The name hung in the air, resonating through the temple. Ethan backed away from the altar, the walking stick held before him like a talisman. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the building itself had spoken. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice cracking. No answer came, but the walls began to tremble. Dust rained from the ceiling as the structure groaned like a living thing in pain. Ethan ran for the door, bursting outside just as the temple's roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash. The village had changed. Buildings that had stood to his left now loomed on his right. Paths that had been straight now curved in dizzying spirals. The entire settlement was rearranging itself, structures sliding across the ground as if the earth beneath were liquid. "This isn't real," Ethan whispered. But the denial rang hollow even to his own ears. He sprinted through the shifting maze, searching for the path that had led him here. But the forest's edge seemed to retreat with each step, the trees bending away as if repelled by his presence. Then he heard it, his own voice calling from between two warped houses. "Hello? Is someone there?" The words were his, but he hadn't spoken them. He approached cautiously, peering around the corner. Empty space greeted him, but his voice came again, this time from behind. "Mason, where are you?" Ethan spun around. Nothing. Yet the voice, his voice, continued, fragments of conversations he'd had since entering the forest echoing from different directions, past and present colliding, time fracturing around him. The markings aren't random. His voice, but distorted, stretched. It sees when you move. Louder now, urgent. "You've come too far." A whisper at his ear. Ethan clapped his hands over his ears, but the voices continued now inside his head. He stumbled forward, desperate to escape the cacophony, and collided with a structure he hadn't seen before. A small shed, its door marked with the familiar spiral, half buried in the ground as if sinking into the earth. The moment he touched the spiral, the voices ceased. Silence descended, heavy and sudden. The walking stick in his hand grew warm, its carvings glowing brighter. The door to the shed swung open of its own accord, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Every instinct screamed danger, but what choice did he have? The village continued to shift around him, buildings folding in on themselves, like a collapsing maze. This underground passage might be his only escape, or a trap. Ethan hesitated only a moment before plunging into the darkness, using the walking stick's glow to light his way. The staircase wound downward in a tight spiral, each step slightly too narrow or too wide, as if designed for feet unlike his own. The air grew thick, charged with the same energy he'd felt throughout the forest, but more concentrated, almost suffocating. The stairs ended in a circular chamber carved from the living bedrock. Its walls were covered in symbols more intricate than any he'd seen before, forming patterns that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of his eye. At the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it— "No," Ethan breathed. Another skeleton, this one still draped in the tattered remains of hiking clothes. Not Olivia, she had died in the village above, but someone else. Someone who had made it this far, only to perish at the final threshold. Ethan approached slowly. The skeleton's hand rested on the pedestal, fingers curled around a knife of polished obsidian. Carved into the stone were symbols matching those in Olivia's notebook, but the final section remained unfinished, the knife abandoned mid-stroke. Around the chamber's perimeter, various artifacts had been carefully arranged. Bundles of dried herbs, stones placed in precise patterns, containers of what might have been blood or ink now dried to dark stains, the remnants of a ritual interrupted. Understanding dawned with terrible clarity. This hadn't been Olivia's final resting place. She had died above, in the village. This was someone else, someone who had found her research and tried to complete what she had started, and they had failed just as she had. Ethan set down his pack and pulled out both journals, comparing their notes to the carvings around him. The diagram in Olivia's notebook matched the pattern on the pedestal almost exactly, except for the unfinished section. "The seal," he murmured. She was trying to restore the seal. According to her notes, the symbols throughout the forest formed a boundary, a magical or interdimensional perimeter that contained something ancient and malevolent, the Watcher. But the seal had weakened over time, allowing it to reach through, to lure curious souls deeper with its markings, feeding on their fear and confusion until they became part of its domain. Olivia had discovered this too late. She had tried to repair the seal from within, but the Watcher had stopped her. This other victim, perhaps another researcher who had come looking for Olivia, had continued her work. And now the task fell to Ethan. He reached for the obsidian knife, and the moment his fingers touched it, something changed. The Watcher's presence, which had been an external force stalking him through the forest, suddenly pushed into his mind. A cold, alien consciousness, brushing against his thoughts. Images flooded his perception. The forest as it had been centuries ago. The first settlers discovering the entity that dwelled within. The ritual they had performed to contain it. The symbols they had carved as warnings to keep others away. And then later explorers, breaking the seal, allowing the Watcher to reach beyond its prison, to lure others in, to feed. Ethan collapsed to his knees, the knife clutched in his hand, as the presence receded. It had shown him these things, not out of kindness but as a taunt, to let him know how small he was, how inevitable his fate. "I won't end up like them," he said through gritted teeth. He studied the unfinished carving, comparing it to Olivia's diagram. The final symbol was complex, a series of interlocking spirals that needed to be carved with perfect precision. One mistake, and the seal would fail again. Ethan positioned the knife, hand trembling. This was his only way out. Complete the ritual, restore the seal, and perhaps he would be expelled from this twisted pocket of reality back into the normal world. Before he could begin, a low rumble shook the chamber. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling. The Watcher had realized his intentions and was moving to stop him. In the far corner of the chamber, darkness gathered, deeper than the absence of light, a void that consumed illumination. It pulsed, expanding, taking on a vague form that Ethan's mind couldn't properly process. Limbs too long, proportions wrong, features that shifted between states of matter. Its presence was unbearable, a pressure against Ethan's sanity that made his vision blur and his thoughts scatter. This was the Watcher in its true form, no longer content to observe from the shadows. "No," Ethan gasped, fighting against the mental assault. "You don't get to win." He slashed the knife across his palm, letting his blood drip onto the pedestal. According to Olivia's notes, the ritual required a sacrifice, life essence freely given. The symbols around the chamber flared to life, responding to the offering. The Watcher shrieked, a sound that existed as much in Ethan's mind as in the air, and lunged forward. Ethan grabbed the walking stick with his bleeding hand, smearing it with blood, and thrust it toward the approaching darkness. The carvings on the stick blazed with blue fire, holding the entity at bay for a precious few seconds. He turned and sprinted for the stairs, knowing he couldn't complete the ritual with the Watcher so close. He needed to find another place, another access point to the seal. Behind him, the chamber began to collapse, stone grinding against stone as the Watcher's rage shook the foundations of the underground structure. Ethan raced up the spiral stairs, the darkness surging after him like a flood of black water. He burst through the door of the shed and into the warped village, not stopping to look back as the ground beneath the structure caved inward with a thunderous roar. The obsidian knife still clutched in one hand, the walking stick in the other. Ethan ran through the rearranging village, blood dripping from his wounded palm. He now understood exactly what needed to be done, and why no one had succeeded before. The village continued to warp around Ethan as he ran, buildings twisting like living things in pain. Paths that led forward suddenly looped back on themselves. Doors opened to reveal brick walls. Windows showed impossible landscapes. The Watcher was toying with him, reshaping reality to confuse and trap him. Ethan clutched the obsidian knife and blood-smeared walking stick, fighting to maintain his sense of direction. According to Olivia's notes, the seal wasn't just in the underground chamber. It extended throughout the forest, culminating in a central node. The largest carving, the one that anchored all others, would be where the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The first symbol, he gasped, realization dawning. It has to be where I first entered. The spiral he'd discovered at the beginning of his journey. It hadn't been a random starting point. It was the keystone of the entire structure, the place where the seal had first been broken and where it needed to be restored. But how could he find his way back? The village and forest had become a labyrinth of shifting reality. Ethan stopped running, forcing himself to calm his racing thoughts. The walking stick grew warm in his grip, its carvings pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm, letting it guide him. When he opened them again, he saw what he'd missed before, a faint trail of light connecting, the symbols visible only when he wasn't looking directly at it. The path, he whispered. It was always there. He followed this ghostly trail, moving carefully through the distorted village until he reached its edge. The forest beyond seemed to shudder as he approached, trees bending away as if in fear or anticipation. Behind him, the ground cracked and heaved as something massive moved beneath the village. The Watcher was no longer content to stalk him from afar. It was coming, tearing through the very fabric of this place to reach him. Ethan plunged into the forest, following the luminous trail that connected symbol to symbol. With each marker he passed, time seemed to fold in on itself. One moment he was running forward, the next he saw himself from behind, approaching a tree he'd passed minutes earlier. Then he was ahead again, watching his past self vanish around a bend. His hands began to change as he ran, flickering between states, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent, sometimes aged with wrinkles not his own. Time was unraveling around him, past and future bleeding into the present. Voices whispered from the trees, not his own this time, but those of others who had walked this path. Turn back, a woman's voice urged. Olivia, he thought. The ritual is flawed. It's a trick, another voice hissed. The seal doesn't free you, it makes you part of it. Ethan, came a voice he recognized instantly. Don't make my mistake. He stumbled, nearly falling. Mason? His brother's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I followed. The symbols, too. I thought I was special, chosen. But the Watcher doesn't choose, it collects. Ethan pressed on, trying to block out the voices. Whether they were real or another of the Watcher's tricks didn't matter. He had to reach the first symbol before the entity caught up to him. The forest grew denser, trees pressing closer, branches reaching like fingers to snag his clothing. Roots erupted from the ground, trying to trip him. The entire forest had become an extension of the Watcher's will, fighting to stop him. Finally, he spotted it, the clearing where he'd first noticed the spiral carving. But it had changed. The spiral now covered the entire trunk of the massive oak, extending into the ground through the roots and up into the branches. At its center was a small, uncarved space, as if waiting for one final mark. Ethan approached, breathing heavily, the obsidian knife ready in his trembling hand. The clearing hummed with energy, the air thick enough to chew. This was the place, where worlds intersected, where the seal had first been broken. He raised the knife to the tree but froze as a voice spoke. Not from the forest this time, but directly into his mind. A voice of many layers, ancient beyond comprehension. "You were always meant to be here, Ethan Grayson." The voice was cold yet intimate, as if the speaker knew him better than he knew himself. "This moment has played out countless times, with countless others. Your brother, the woman. All who follow the markings come to this same choice. And all become part of the cycle." Ethan's hand trembled, the knife tip just inches from the tree bark. "You're lying." "Am I? Look at your hands, Ethan. Look at what you're becoming." He glanced down and gasped. His hands were translucent, flickering between solidity and a state of half-existence. Like the Watcher, neither fully here nor fully gone. "The seal doesn't banish me," the voice continued. "It contains me, and all who complete it become part of the container. Part of me." Doubt crept in. What if the voice was right? What if Olivia's ritual wasn't an escape but a trap? The warning voices had tried to tell him, "The seal doesn't free you, it makes you part of it." But then he remembered something from Olivia's notes. The Watcher lies. It twists truth to create doubt. Its greatest power is making you question your own mind. "No," Ethan said firmly. "Mason wouldn't have tried to complete the ritual if it was a trap. He would have warned me away completely." Without further hesitation, he pressed the obsidian blade to the tree and began to carve, completing the spiral with precise, determined strokes. As he worked, his hands continued to distort, sometimes resembling those of others. Smaller, feminine hands that must have been Olivia's. Larger, familiar ones that could only be Mason's. And still others, countless victims who had stood where he now stood. The forest roared around him, trees thrashing violently. The ground beneath him trembled as something massive approached, crashing through the underbrush with terrible purpose. "You cannot escape what you are becoming," the voice hissed, now tinged with what sounded almost like fear. Ethan's vision blurred, reality fracturing around him. He saw overlapping images, himself carving the symbol, Olivia doing the same years earlier, Mason before her, and still others, stretching back through time. All of them here, all part of the same moment, completing the same ritual. Had he ever had a choice? Or was this moment inevitable from the second he'd entered Black Hollow Forest? The walking stick blazed in his free hand, guiding his movements as he carved the final curve of the spiral. The symbol began to glow, connecting with the network of markings throughout the forest, forming a complex geometric pattern that extended beyond what human eyes could perceive. "You will never leave," the Watcher's voice promised, closer now. "None of you ever leave." Ethan ignored it, focusing entirely on the final line, a straight cut through the center of the spiral that would complete the seal. He raised the knife, hands steadier now despite their translucence, and brought it down in one swift motion. The blade connected with the tree, slicing through the bark with surprising ease. The moment he completed the mark, the forest screamed. Not a sound of wind or breaking branches, but a primal shriek of something ancient being bound against its will. The symbols throughout the forest flared with blinding intensity, the network of light pulsing outward from the central spiral, forming a dome of energy that encompassed the entire area. The ground heaved beneath Ethan's feet, throwing him backward onto the forest floor. Then abruptly silence fell. Complete, absolute silence. Ethan slowly rose to his feet, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The walking stick had gone dark, its carvings now just ordinary markings in wood. The obsidian knife in his hand had crumbled to dust. He turned, expecting to see the Watcher, and froze. The entity stood at the edge of the clearing, a silhouette of perfect stillness, neither advancing nor retreating, waiting. But why? Ethan stood motionless, staring at the frozen silhouette of the Watcher. The ritual was complete. He had carved the final symbol, restored the seal that bound the entity to this place. According to Olivia's notes, this should have expelled him from the distorted pocket of reality, returned him to the normal world. Yet here he remained, and so did the Watcher, unmoving, but still present. "I don't understand," Ethan whispered. "It should be over." The forest had gone quiet, the unnatural. Stillness no longer menacing, but expectant, as if holding its breath. The symbols on the trees continued to glow faintly, pulsing with slow, steady light. Not extinguished, merely paused. Ethan glanced down at his hands. The translucence remained, his flesh flickering between solidity and a ghost-like state. He was caught between worlds, neither fully here nor gone. Something had gone wrong, or perhaps something was still missing. He approached the central tree where he'd carved the final symbol, examining it more closely. The spiral was complete, exactly as shown in Olivia's diagram. But as he circled the massive trunk, he noticed something on the opposite side, a smaller carving hidden from his initial view. The markings were different from the others, cruder and more desperate in their execution. Not part of the original seal, but added later, by Olivia, he guessed, in her final moments of clarity. "One must stay. One must take the mark." Ethan ran his fingers over the words, a chill spreading through him. He pulled out Olivia's notebook, flipping frantically through the final pages he'd only skimmed before. There in the margin of the last entry, a note he'd overlooked. "The seal requires a guardian, someone to remain, to become part of the boundary. The price of closing the door is that someone must become the door." Understanding dawned with terrible finality. The ritual wasn't just about restoring symbols, it required a sacrifice. A human consciousness to serve as anchor for the seal, to remain trapped forever between worlds, neither fully alive nor dead. Olivia had discovered this truth too late. She had completed the ritual but refused the final step, refused to become the guardian, or to force that fate on someone else. Ethan sank to his knees, the weight of realization crushing him. He was now faced with the same choice: to accept this fate, to become part of the forest's boundary for eternity, or to find another way. "You understand now?" The voice came from the shadows. Not the menacing, multi-layered tone of the Watcher, but a familiar voice that made Ethan's heart ache. "Mason?" A figure emerged from between the trees. Not the brother he remembered, but something caught between states. Mason Grayson appeared mostly solid but translucent around the edges, like a photograph slowly fading. He wore the same hiking clothes Ethan had last seen him in, seemingly untouched by a decade's passage. "You shouldn't have followed the markings, little brother," Mason said, his voice distant yet clear. Ethan struggled to his feet. You're the guardian. You took the mark." Mason nodded slowly. "I found this place just like you did. Curious, stubborn. I completed the ritual, but when I understood what it needed," he gestured to himself, "I couldn't let anyone else pay the price." "But why didn't you just leave? Escape while you could?" A sad smile crossed Mason's face. "There was another hiker. Lost, scared, stumbled into the forest by accident. The Watcher would have taken her if I hadn't." He trailed off, but Ethan understood. His brother had sacrificed his own freedom, his own existence, to save a stranger. It was exactly the kind of thing Mason would do. "But the seal is weakening," Mason continued. "I can't hold it much longer. That's why the Watcher has been able to reach further, to lure new victims. It needs a new guardian, someone's consciousness to maintain the boundary." "Me," Ethan whispered. Mason's expression softened. "It doesn't have to be you, Ethan. You don't have to die here." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, a sound came from the forest, a crashing of underbrush, labored breathing. Someone else was in the woods, approaching the clearing. A figure stumbled into view, a young woman, disheveled and disoriented, a backpack hanging from one shoulder. Her eyes were wide with fear, her movements jerky with exhaustion. "Hello," she called, voice cracking. "Is someone there? I've been lost for hours." Ethan stared at her in horror, the full implication of Mason's words hitting him. She was real, not a hallucination or trick. An innocent who had wandered into Black Hollow Forest while the boundaries between worlds were thin. Mason stepped closer to Ethan, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The ritual is complete, but the guardian must be chosen. It can be you, or it can be her." The Watcher's silhouette at the edge of the clearing began to shift, its form rippling, like heat distortion. It was waiting, Ethan realized, waiting for his choice. "This is what it's been doing all along," Ethan said, voice hollow. "Luring people in, forcing them into impossible choices." "Yes," Mason confirmed. "And once the choice is made, the cycle begins again. The chosen becomes the guardian until they weaken or find a replacement, the other goes free." The woman noticed them now, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank God. I thought I was going to die out here. My phone's dead and I've been walking in circles for hours." She started toward them, unaware of the malevolent presence watching from the shadows, unaware of the choice being made about her fate. Ethan felt sick. To save himself, he would have to condemn this stranger to an eternity trapped between worlds, just as someone before Mason had likely faced the same choice. An endless cycle of moral horror, passing the burden down through unwitting victims. "Mason did this for you," the Watcher's voice whispered in his mind. "He chose to stay so another could go free. Will you dishonor his sacrifice by choosing differently?" The weight of the decision pressed down on Ethan. His brother had made the noble choice, the selfless one. But could Ethan live with himself if he sacrificed this woman to save his own life? "There has to be another way," he insisted. Mason shook his head sadly. "I've had 10 years to search for one. There isn't." The woman approached, slowing as she sensed the tension. Is everything okay?" The symbols pulsed brighter, responding to her proximity. The Watcher's form solidified slightly, its anticipation palpable in the air. "One must stay," Ethan repeated, the cruel words burning in his mind. He looked at the woman, young, her whole life ahead of her, then at Mason, trapped for a decade in this half-existence because of his selfless choice, and finally at himself, the one who had come looking for answers, who had willingly followed the path despite the warnings. In that moment, Ethan knew what he had to do. Whether it was truly his choice or simply the inevitable conclusion to a path laid out long before he entered the forest, he couldn't say. Perhaps free will was just another illusion in this place where reality bent to the Watcher's design. The woman took another step closer, oblivious to her role in this ancient, terrible cycle. Ethan made his choice, and the forest responded. Ethan gasped awake, jolting upright as if breaking through the surface of deep water. Sunlight filtered through tree branches above, dappling the ground around him with golden patterns. He lay at the edge of a forest, his backpack beside him, everything seemingly normal. The trailhead sign for Black Hollow Forest stood a few yards away. He blinked, disoriented. Had it all been a dream? The symbols, the Watcher, Mason, the lost hiker, all products of exhaustion or dehydration? Ethan fumbled for his phone, relieved, to find it working again. The screen lit up with dozens of missed calls and messages, the most recent from just hours ago. His heart pounded when he saw the date, November 15th. He had entered the forest on September 27th. Almost 2 months had passed. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. He scrolled through the messages, increasingly frantic texts from friends, from his boss, from search and rescue teams. He had been declared missing after failing to return from his hike. The final message was from the Park Ranger Service, informing all personnel that the search had been officially called off 3 weeks ago. Ethan rose to his feet. legs unsteady, and turned to look back at the forest. It appeared perfectly ordinary. Tall pines swaying gently in the autumn breeze, nothing to suggest the nightmare realm he had experienced. No twisted trees, no glowing symbols, no impossible village. Yet his body told a different story. He had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His face, reflected in his phone's black screen, looked gaunt, eyes sunken and haunted. His beard had grown wild, untrimmed for weeks. He had been somewhere during those missing months, even if the forest now pretended otherwise. The last thing he remembered was making his choice in the clearing, as the lost hiker approached and the watcher waited. After that, nothing. A blank space where memory should be. Ethan took a tentative step away from the forest's edge, half expecting reality to warp around him to pull him back in, but the world remained solid, normal, the laws of physics firmly in place. He reached for his water bottle, suddenly aware of his parched throat. As he lifted his arm, his sleeve rode up, revealing something that made him freeze in horror. A spiral, identical to the ones he had seen throughout the forest, marked his skin. Not a fresh wound, but a raised scar, perfectly healed as if it had been there for years. He pushed his sleeve higher, finding more symbols trailing up his arm, in an intricate pattern. His hands shook as he yanked up his other sleeve, then pulled down the collar of his shirt. The markings continued across his body, a network of scars that matched the pattern he had completed in the forest. The seal. Somehow it had transferred to him. Ethan stumbled back, bumping into his pack and knocking it over. The contents, spilled out, standard hiking gear, his map, compass. No journal, no walking stick, no obsidian knife, no evidence of what had happened. But as he knelt to gather his belongings, something caught his eye, his reflection in a puddle of rainwater. He leaned closer, squinting at the distorted image. His shadow moved before he did, shifting slightly ahead of his own movements like a delayed echo. When he raised his hand, the shadow's hand lifted a fraction of a second earlier. "No," he whispered, backing away from the puddle. "No, no, no." He hadn't escaped at all. Something had come back with him, or perhaps something of him had remained behind, and what returned was not entirely Ethan Grayson anymore. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment he could see the clearing again. Mason's translucent form, the lost hiker's confused expression, the watcher waiting in the shadows. He remembered his choice, the words he had spoken. "Take me instead. Let her go." The woman had vanished, expelled from the forest's distorted reality back to the normal world, and Ethan had begun to fade, to become the new guardian of the seal. But then, something had changed. Mason had stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's chest, directly over his heart. "Not all of you," his brother had said. "Not this time." Ethan's eyes snapped open, understanding flooding through him. Mason had found a third option, not freedom or imprisonment, but something in between. The seal had been divided between them, brother to brother, allowing Ethan to leave while Mason remained. But the price was that Ethan would carry part of the forest's curse with him, a piece of the boundary etched into his very flesh. His phone rang, startling him from his revelation. A local number he didn't recognize. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. "Hello? Ethan Grayson?" The voice was female, vaguely familiar. "My name is Rebecca Winters. You might not remember me." A chill ran down his spine. "Who are you?" "I got lost in Black Hollow Forest last month. I was hiking alone, stupid, I know. And then something happened. I found these weird symbols carved into the trees and..." She paused, voice trembling. "And then suddenly I was at the trailhead, with no memory of how I got there. But ever since then I've been having these dreams. About you. And about someone named Mason. The lost hiker. The one he had saved." "How did you get this number?" Ethan asked, his mouth dry. "That's the weird part. I found it carved into my hiking stick when I woke up at the trailhead. I've been trying to call for weeks, but it kept saying your phone was out of service until today." Ethan looked back at the forest, its innocent facade belying the horror that lurked within. "Rebecca, I need you to stay away from that forest. Don't go near it again, understand? But the dreams, they're getting worse. And there are these marks on my skin." "What marks?" Ethan demanded, heart sinking. "Spirals. Like tattoos, but I never got them. They just appeared." The seal hadn't just marked him, it had marked her too. Less extensively perhaps, but enough to maintain a connection. The cycle wasn't over, it had merely evolved. As Ethan stood there, phone pressed to his ear, a distant sound came from deep within the forest, a scream cut short. Someone else had entered Black Hollow, someone who was now finding the first carved symbol, the beginning of the path. "Rebecca, listen carefully," he said, voice low and urgent. "We need to meet. There are things you need to know. Things about the forest, about what happened to us." As he spoke, he noticed something on the nearest tree, just a flicker in his peripheral vision, gone when he looked directly at it. But he knew what it was. The symbols were reappearing, visible only to those who carried the mark. The Watcher was reaching out again, using him and Rebecca as its new conduits. The forest had let them go physically, but part of them would always remain within it, and part of it would always remain within them. Ethan ended the call with a promise to meet Rebecca soon. He shouldered his pack and began walking toward the parking lot, away from Black Hollow Forest. Each step felt both like an escape and a betrayal, leaving Mason behind once more. His shadow moved just slightly out of sync with his body, a constant reminder of what he had become. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could feel that Watcher's presence, distant but undeniable, a cold consciousness that had tasted his fear and would never truly let him go. Ethan looked over his shoulder one last time at the forest's edge. The trees stood innocent in the afternoon light, their bark smooth and unmarked. No carvings, no warnings, no sign of the horrors that dwelled within. But he knew they were there. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.